Hi everyone, Pooka here. Today's installment is the last of the two-hander episodes that I recorded with Terry Robinson before his passing, on the topic of the Mystic Syndicate, by which we meant the curiously unmutual practices of the Technocracy convention, not to be confused with the actual play podcast of the same name, nor the North Carolina-based jazz-funk hip-hop pop fusion supergroup. This was a rough one to get through, and there were so many more notes and ideas, and questions or comments from the listeners that we didn't have time to cover. However, that does leave the door open for a possible part 2 with another co-host in the future, something Terry and I never got the chance to do. After this, there is still a few recordings of interviews and discussions with Terry around PAX Unplugged in December that I plan to sort through and share eventually. In the meantime, I hope that this one is an enjoyable listen, so without further ado, some words.
Hi, Mage fans. This is your diminished but present host of Mage the Podcast, Terry Robinson. And joining me today in my living room where I barely had the energy to get up the stairs is co-host and friend of the show and host of the delightful Changeling the Podcast, Pook. Pook, how you doing?
Terry, some living rooms don't even have stairs, and I think that you should take solace in the fact that as hard as getting up them might have been, they exist.
I think the best indicator of my current level of energy is the fact that shredding a block of cheese is exhausting. Now, in contrast to that, my spouse, who you have met on several occasions, and who I would describe as having mighty thews for a lady of her carriage, is now trying to figure out the fastest way to shred a block of cheese, to the point where she is timing herself whenever she does it. And she was excited that she broke the 3-minute mark for a 1 kilo, 2.2 pound block.
Did she use her bare hands? Just
she did. A cheese shredder was used.
I could imagine her though, just like slowly crushing the life out of a cheese until it crumbles into, acceptable fragments.
In the same way that you would crumble cheese by giving it a withering cross-examination of the assumptions that the cheese chose in its thesis of some sort.
That's what I do with smoked Gouda.
I think every Mage, the podcast host and co-host, has a different way in which they would decimate either physically or spiritually a block of cheese.
We talk about making parallels between mage groups and paradigms and stuff by choosing a single effect and saying how would each of them do a fireball? I think this is an acceptable replacement.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. But anyway, we today are going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and wallet, and that is the Syndicate. Now, this may be the first of 2 or 3 or 5 parts, depending on how things go, but kind of the inception to me was the fact that I felt that the Syndicate was kind of pigeonholed. In different editions, it's had different levels of expansiveness. In 1E, Satiros described it as the Technocracy Mafia. And then in second edition, it kind of got expanded into saying that they have this open market operations, and then they have illicit market operations. Revised made it massive in terms of what they did. And at some point, an Entropy 5 effect was cast on the entire Mage community to suggest that the Syndicate and the NWO were going to bust out in fisticuffs at any point. And it was like, oh man, the Technocracy Civil War's coming. No evidence really exists of that until late in Revised. In fact, so late in Revised that Werewolf 20 had already come out. And then we get to Technocracy Reloaded, where it's like, oh yeah, the Syndicate's in charge. How is this ever even a question? Yeah. And then there's just this little background notion of there having potentially been a Technocracy Civil War. To me, I find them fascinating because they know what they're doing, seemingly. The practices and instruments are often mundane, with Life 3 being access to an extraordinary medic that may help clean up a gunshot wound in an afternoon. And to me, they're one of the groups that makes me go, maybe effects should be results-based as opposed to process-based. Because I think a lot of the things they do, you wind up into these weird spaces where it's like, well, you need mind 3 and correspondence 3 to tell your minion from far away. And you're like, no, it's an instrument. You just call them with your phone and they come and they do the thing. Like your matter 3 effect is you have a welder that's on hand.
Do you not think that's kind of cheating a little bit though? Like, oh, my instrument is this person.
No.
Like, isn't that just a retainer? Or
no, that is the thing that makes it compelling. Anyone else who wants to get to the same point has to do all this other stuff. But in the process, that also means that the Syndicate frequently cedes a lot of what they could do. I think backgrounds in Mage are understated because they're not well systematized. And like a guy with allies 5 or 8 dots and supernatural allies.
It's one popular guy.
Exactly. I can go, I think can go completely toe to toe with most starting groups of mages. And I think that's partially what makes it kind of compelling. We also talk about like symbols and the kind of study of economic power. I've spent time around people that are worth like tens of millions, but not maybe hundreds of millions. I think I've met 2 billionaires, and that's kind of been my contact with that. I've also worked in insurance for the past 13 years. I know a lot of people that have gone into finance and so on. I've spent time at Lloyd's of London and seen the weird rituals that are done there. It's a field dominated by men, and weird things happen when guys spend a lot of time around each other and there aren't any women.
No comment.
Yes, or at least when there aren't any people that break that masculine stereotype. Some of them bordered on what appeared to be like a harvest, a sacrifice to make sure that there was a good harvest or to prove your manhood. Like shareholder meetings look surprisingly similar to tent revival meetings in some cases. And I don't know about you, my ideas for games frequently come to me in terms of what I call a tableau, which is just a single scene that is there in its entirety and is of a piece. Like the last Chronicle I ran, I imagined a bunch of Amish people by a sea coast where the sky was pink and the water was purple, doing some sort of harvest and kind of etching out patterns that looked like particle traces, kind of as a form of prayer. And that just kind of came to me, and I worked backwards and I created a whole realm for it. And my characters basically dealt with the space Amish. And the one for this was, I really wanted to do a recording where it was a Syndicate board meeting that sounded like an evangelical pastor. And then I wanted to do a chorister meeting that really sounded like an executive board meeting. Like our conversion throughput channel pipelines are up 5.5% quarter over quarter. And I think that's a fun place that Mage lets you get to.
We haven't allocated enough in the budget for Chrism.
Yeah, or something like that. Or to be like, hey, we've done A/B testing on these new hosts or the music that we play at our churches, and we get a 1.1 improved retention rate when we stick with the acoustic rather than the electric guitar or something like that. And I don't even consider that to be like parody. Like if you're really waging a war for reality, some people are going to take a very technical view for it. So I kind of have my starting principles for that I try and keep in mind when I think of the Syndicate. But the last bit was in M20, the art that we have for each of the splats is pretty evocative in a lot of cases.
Adjective in my head.
Yeah. And the one for the progenitor shows a woman, like I think she's petting the cyborg tiger or something like that. And the void engineer obviously has a space gun. And then the Syndicate guy is just drinking a martini with a $sign above his head and a flock of crows. No one knows what to do with a Syndicate. And I think there's so much space for super fun weirdness. Like, what do you find compelling about the Syndicate? And maybe why do you think it is a place where we could have a lot more mystical elements?
I sort of think that within the Technocracy, the Syndicate strikes me as maybe the most mystical in the sense of they understand that consensus is fundamentally a fragile construct, and they understand that it's at its most powerful when the inner workings are obscure. Because if you look at like the progenitors and Iteration X and void engineers, they all deal with things that are, if not material, at least sensible, and they can be conceived of as extensions of what sleepers deal with in terms of medicine, engineering, space exploration. New World Order, I think, makes a good foil for the Syndicate because they similarly understand that consensus is this malleable thing, but maybe they believe that they can strengthen it by doing this like top-down control thing. So if you want to put it in metaphysical trinity terms, if they're the stasis, then the Syndicate strikes me as more like agents of dynamism. They understand that the economy they manipulate, or economies, I should say, plural, they're like an ocean almost. You know, they're enduring and powerful, but you have to surf on top of those waves, and if you don't keep moving forward, you wipe out. And I'm throwing metaphors around.
Oh, that's fine.
No doubt so does the Syndicate. So when it comes to mysticism, I think there's kind of an eye of the beholder element. There's a line in one of the Syndicate convention books where they point out that they're the only convention who understand and believe that consensus is by the masses for the masses. And they love the masses because they know how to play them like a piano. So that gullibility breeds mystique vis-a-vis the Syndicate in the same way as it would for a tent revival leader, maybe. Yeah. But when you're dealing with sleepers, probably more than any other convention, and your enlightened science, be it applied psychology, hypermarketing, comparative semiotics, whatever, if it's based around creating phantom realities to manipulate the real one, the line between like a rigorous approach that you understand internally as enlightened science and the facade of power you project externally, the line between those starts to kind of blur. If you're regularly applying an enlightened method to some economic system in order to generate windfalls, then the masses believe you have some kind of uncanny talent. And at what point do you start to believe the hype yourself? What is a macroeconomic forecast but a divination ritual, except instead of crystal balls or tea leaves, the arcane process you're using is statistics. So I think their greatest success within the technocracy was to shape consensus so that sleepers believe their methods are somehow more real than the traditions, despite being equally obtuse for the average schlub, I guess.
Yeah. And you brought up the fact that the difference between the Weaver, as it were, the different aspects of the metaphysical trinity that could be represented by each of the groups. A thing that I've always thought is, I feel as if a lot of these groups will have had enough contact with werewolves or mages or something that even, or they have spent time in the High Umbra, or they intercepted a missive, that the idea of the Weaver, Wild, and Worm, or dynamism, entropy, stasis, has seeped into how they do things. And to me, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people in the Syndicate that talked about the laboratory, the market, and the scrap heap. That they all have their own version of this, and they consider themselves masters of the market. That the iterators and the progenitors come up with the ideas. It is their job to bring it to the market and properly ride it. And the NWO maybe is the one that keeps track of the consensus and just gets rid of what isn't working. And that NWO Syndicate dichotomy to me was always interesting because I didn't want to come up with a version where the NWO was wrong. Like we always have the idea that for the social groups, the Syndicate and the NWO, one is collectivist, one is more individualist, in the same way that the progenitors are individualist and the iterators are collectivist. And then you have the void engineers who are kind of smack dab in the middle. And one of the things that I think about is the idea of the NWO can win if it can control all information, or if it can see the information landscape and really pick off the most dangerous ideas or promote the most helpful ones. Is there a future where computational power gets so great that recentralizing makes sense and the NWO suddenly becomes ascendant? Yuval Noah Harari talks about kind of the difference between capitalism and communism being a question of information clearing. Communism can make sense in, and again, this is simply the aspect of communism where you have central planning. I fully understand that there's a larger collection of ideas that come with that. But for instance, if you have a large, diffuse empire with poor information moving between parties, then central planning suddenly makes sense. If you have one entity that has a better view of everything and can say, no, we need this here, we need this here, that will make more sense than just waiting for market signals, which may be slow and inaccurate. Right now, we're kind of in an era where no one has that kind of central processing power, but maybe within the technocracy, they have those trinary decks, they have those quantum rigs, they have those high-level magical effects that do allow, at some way, the ability to see everything and to go, no, we really need this over here. But I feel like the natural follow-up to this is we do an NWO episode where I just go, you know literally anything about the social sciences, talk to me.
Well, just as a tangent, you mentioned, so I feel like there's going to be lots of naming of theory books through this episode, and just in relation to something that I had just said in the first convention book, among other inspirations, they have Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which equally, I think you could call that book Manufacturing Consensus in Mage terms, because it's that idea of constructing the illusory reality in order to, sometimes for nefarious ends. And I feel like the Syndicate does that, maybe not necessarily as nefarious, but at least self-serving ends. I also think, though, when it comes to like the NWO versus the Syndicate, I almost feel like the Syndicate doesn't want to make everything predictable. I think having that element of chaos, if they know it's there and they leave it alone, that works fundamentally to their advantage. And they just kind of react to it. And NWO probably can't stand that.
Yeah.
Like, no, we have to know what's going to happen. We have to be ready for it. And the Syndicate's like, we will be ready for it. Just trust us. You know?
Yeah, I think the Syndicate very much has baked into their ideas that the stricter a paradigm or a set of interactions becomes, the more extreme that backlash is going to be. When you have a market correction, it is going to be wild. But like, there are a few things I tried to keep in mind when thinking about the Syndicate, kind of going back to first principles. And this is something that's clearly established in M20. The Syndicate is in charge of accounting for and taking stock and storing everything of value. I'm sure there's a huge exemption from this of information. Information is valuable, probably not theirs primarily to control. But this includes like nodes, wonders, artifacts, currency, which is the Technocracy term for tasks. They have to have these vast storehouses of weird stuff, and they have to kind of make sense of it. So I feel as if one of the mystic angles is they're just running into it more. Like, they have probably talons and fetishes in some secure location. It may also be one of the few cases where the Syndicate has umbral or deep umbral locales, because they're like, we can't safely store this in mundane reality, or something like that. Or maybe they have their weird, are you familiar with the company Iron Mountain?
Oh, I am.
Yes. So
They
Iron
used to
Mountain
come every Thursday.
Yeah, Iron Mountain is a company that does document storage and now document destruction, as well as data storage, that literally operated out of a hollowed out salt mine, I think.
I think something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And the idea was, we are in a tectonically stable region. If you need to store a document for a century, we will be able to do it. And it being a hollowed out mountain, like, the internal temperature never moved from like 58 degrees or something like that over the course of the year. And I imagine the Syndicate has to have that.
In my experience, I will say, though, a lot of the things that we sent to Iron Mountain were of no value to anybody.
Speaking of symbolic rituals, yes.
Yeah. But not only that, I mean, with stuff not their own, I imagine the Syndicate could find different value than what the creator had in mind. So the example that I was thinking of was, if you consider a node that becomes an Instagram spot, like Stonehenge or something, or the wonder that becomes a limited run exhibit at a museum. So mechanically, I'd like to see them have maybe rotes with primal utility that essentially allow them to overlay their own effects on a wonder. Not necessarily erasing what came before, but being able to deploy it in a way that suits their needs. Or with a node, if like their branding people recast the nature of a neighborhood, can they shift the resonance to be more in tune with their style? So I think that would be more in keeping with their subtle approach to fighting the traditionalists, where they don't confront them head on, but rather erode and refashion the parameters of their enemy's own tools. That's something I really loved in the original, or the revised convention book, when it's like, how do we deal with the traditions? We appropriate and repackage their cultures, and then gives like a blow by blow of how they do it with every single one. And it's like, that's devastating and brilliant. So
kind of the next principle to me was, the Syndicate seems to be one of the most practical of the groups. And this kind of goes off of a few other things. One, they felt like a group that would be embedded in cultures, because no one wants to make a deal with somebody who doesn't get them in a lot of cases. So you and I just came off of reading the World of Darkness East Asia setting books, and that was kind of a recurring theme of how much do we want to deal with people not like us, who may not understand our values and will not respect us. And those books had the full spectrum of, I'm in a bind, I need to cut a deal with whoever I can, to, I will use this ignorant outsider, to, this person is like me and gets me. So even if I don't like their ends, at least I think they're honest, or at least they're like me. And I just appreciated that those books kind of went through the same thing. And to me, the Syndicate is kind of the same way, that they're going to be frequently embedded in a culture or set of cultures. And that is going to be their edge. In business, we have the idea of monopolistically competitive goods. And these are goods that are differentiated. That, for instance, only Adidas can produce Adidas shoes, kind of by definition. So someone who has intimate familiarity with a culture, there may be better business opportunities, but this is the best they have because we talk about assets. There are certainly intangible ones as well. And cultural capital, cachet, and looking like your customer are certainly going to be parts of it.
You just let me know when you want me to go down that rabbit hole. I'm ready.
One moment. Another thing was that the NWO and the Syndicate, to me, compete in fundamentally different ways. The NWO is willing to report you to HR, as it were, in a way that I don't feel the Syndicate would. So like if somebody in the NWO is doing this internal politicking, they can be declared unmutual or something like that. I really don't feel as if the Syndicate is evaluated that way. The question is, did you safely make us money? Or did you safely disperse the goods that you were in your charge for? Did you safely control this media market? And they don't really care too much about the how in comparison. And I think because they are embedded in a culture in a lot of cases, they're going to pick up bits from it. In the same way that, like, I wish there were a mechanic in Mage to be like, your Hermetic and my Verbena have wildly different paradigms, but we've seen the other person do their magic so much, we have to have picked up something.
I have an idea about that, actually.
Okay.
So one of the best novels that I've read in recent years is The Seventh Function of Language by Laurent Binet, which, aside from being a pitch-perfect parody of 80s French intelligentsia, hilarious, it has characters who do, for lack of a better Mage analogy, academics roles left and right. So like the one sidekick for the protagonist is a semiotics graduate student and has this almost uncanny talent to like read a scene symbolically and like make these conclusions that help them in their quest. So I know NWO is supposedly the more academic leaning one, but I feel like the Syndicate, like that's an approach that they could take where they're able to do that cultural, I don't know what verb I want there, but it's like a very methodical kind of like assessing the situation on the basis of symbolism and kind of leveraging that into getting what they want.
I feel as if the Society of Ether and the Virtual Adepts have a similar toolbox. Like when writing Lore of the Traditions, I inserted paradigm analysis as a tool that Virtual Adepts can use.
That was...
Where it's like, oh no, this isn't a prayer to summon Michael. You're actually just using a sequential tone row whose resonance allows you to commune with this particular resonance structure in the high umbra. I can do the same thing.
Your programming language is prayer. Fine.
Exactly. Yeah. Or something like that. And I feel like the Syndicate would do that. I feel like the Syndicate would have an interest in those topics in the same way that like I have an interest in language versus how you have it. Like you have made it notionally a profession. Notionally. Attempted to. Whereas for me, it is a curiosity where I read pop books on it and occasionally dip into the occasional academic article. I do think the Syndicate, every one of them, would be able to quote Baudrillard. I do think simulation and simulacrum is probably a little more core to them than any other group.
That one didn't make it into my notes, strangely.
Oh, but okay.
Yeah, that's...
And kind of like because of that storehouse aspect, I wonder if there's just like the node guy in the Syndicate. Like how do they break that down?
Yeah.
Like, is it done based on, I imagine it would be done regionally, but there is some cross-group expertise. But I do want to see that renegade Syndicate wonder trader who just kind of got tired of it and wanted to be more of an Indiana Jones type or something like that. But it feels to me that in almost any case you can justify a Syndicate member knowing something about a mystic paradigm.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Yeah.
You also made me think in terms of like the tattling bit. I would love to see some kind of trust busting or mutual competition or healthy competition clause. That's the term I think I want, where it's like an acting in concert effect, but you're actually working in opposition to the person who shares your paradigm and practice. So it's like the idea of two Syndicate members, by competing with each other, they are working together in order to create some kind of beneficial effect for the market. That, I imagine, is the kind of culture that they would have internally, rather than I'm gonna sell you out or whatever.
I picture the iterators coming up with this advance that they want to introduce to the masses, and they don't know how to do it. And they're like, hey, we have this new computing paradigm that's going to be wild. We're gonna shove a supercomputer inside of your glasses. So instead of just rolling out slow advances, you have the two biggest companies, Pearsoft and Microsoft or something, debut this crappy version of it. And then just instead of slowly rolling out advances, it's viewed as them competing with one another. And that is how the consensus is made to accept this advance, because the narrative is no longer scientific advance. It is two market competitors. Yeah. So the framework of, is this a reasonable pace of advancement, gets thrown out the window by, oh, of course, these two competing companies, we suddenly have nearly conscious AI models, because that's what we've led to believe is going to be what happens when Amazon, Anthropological, and OpenAI all compete with each other.
The engine of consensus, Terry, is one-up-personship, which is a word I've just invented.
I generally go for a gender-neutral version. The one exception that I haven't been able to do is craftspersonship. Just doesn't quite have the sonorousness of craftsmanship that I want.
I kind of wish we used monger more. Like, just as an agentive anything. Like,
I mean, you and I are both audio mongers. We're well-established podcast mongers.
Well, and today you've been a waffle monger, which I appreciate. Like,
waffle monger sounds like an insult two children would throw at each other. Be like,
such a waffle monger.
Spreckens, you dick.
Can we talk about primal utility for a second?
Sure.
Because like the way it's written up in revised Syndicate is so much more interesting than the rather cursory overview that we get in M20.
Same thing happens with the data sphere. Yeah,
fair. But given the sort of like, we get this correspondence chart related thing with investment and whatnot in the revised convention book, and it makes me think like, what if you reversed the flow in a way? Like if human resources are fungible resources along with all the others, could you, for example, manipulate things to get sleepers hired or otherwise pulled into a venture that you're squeezing juice from as a syndicate member, and then like that turns into a syndicate flavored form of human sacrifice for Quint, you know? I just have all these ideas about primal utility and nowhere to put them.
Yeah, the thing about primal utility as a sphere is fundamentally it wants to be able to do everything that Prime can do.
Yeah.
But seemingly in a different way. So like, let's take, for example, the Prime 1 ability where you can turn blood into quintessence, which doesn't match any of the dot levels that is indicated, but it's been in there since 2nd edition Mage. To me, the thing about the Syndicate or the Technocracy version of a sphere is in some way you should be trading time, coincidentiality, and breadth for one another. So to me, that Prime 1 effect where you burn a retainer by kind of working them to death, they take those health levels of damage. It's just as opposed to someone using an Athane to slit their palm to do it. This is something that might take days to generate.
Okay.
And to me, I can very much get it to the same place. What I thought you were saying was, in the same way that you can pull quintessence from a venture, can we just push quintessence into a venture to kind of make it succeed? That you have this pet project that you really want to have going, like for whatever reason, Ethiopian fast food is something you want to make happen.
Oh my God.
So you wind up, but it's not quite there yet. I don't know how much the West loves teff as a flower, but can you do the opposite? Can you dump Quint into something to almost preternaturally force it to succeed? And I think kind of the answer is yes.
Yeah,
I think the problem, though, that we run into with a lot of these things is, how do we square this interpretation with what in other groups seems to be much more transactional, obvious, and quid pro quo? Because the moment you call it mystical, you're like, yeah, of course I can cut my hand and get quintessence. But the moment we kind of go into this technomantic paradigm, we kind of want it to make more sense. Mm-hmm. And I think we should loosen how much sense we want it to make. Because if it makes total sense, you have just described science, which is not magic.
Yeah.
And I think that's a place that we run into in some cases. And this is a weird case where I think Sorcerer's Crusade was super useful in that one of the things it banged on about was, okay, so you have this Order of Reason guy. He's calculating a firing table to shoot a crossbow. How is that different from shooting it? And the book is like, 1 or 2 successes on a magic roll should be the equivalent of 5 or 6 successes on a mundane roll. And to me, that's something I try and keep in the back of my mind when I'm trying to parse out, again, the syndicate member who calls in an EMT or a medic. Like, that's going to be the most effective medic that you've ever seen at minimum.
And they'll be there very quickly. Yeah.
Another consideration that was going through as I was thinking through this is the idea that how do we represent very complex data? Like, I think there is a breakdown or a shortage in the sciences and business right now in explainability, understandability, and comprehensiveness. I think you and I have probably both come across academic articles that have graphs in them that are utterly nonsensical. I will include a link in the show notes to Angela Collier's wonderful video on why violin graphs are the dumbest thing in existence.
What is a violin graph?
I will show one to you, and
listeners will hear my reaction.
And Pooka, tell me if this reminds you of a certain part of the body that you would rather not have.
Oh dear.
Yes, oh dear, is the way to put it. And the problem is that graph, I would be okay with it if it had amazing expressibility to it. It doesn't. Yeah. The explanatory power of this versus a box and whisker plot is not that considerable. But in arguably my favorite science fiction book of all time, Peter Watts's Blind Sight, the leader of the crew, who happens to be a vampire,
Oh, yeah.
talks about how humans are very good at recognizing faces and the feelings that the faces are expressing. If I were to show you a graph that had 16 parameters to it, it would be ridiculous. It would be utterly incomprehensible. Or it would be a table which would have all the information but be very difficult to parse. In the book, they talk about how you can notice 30 parameters on a face without difficulty. I'm looking at Pooka. I have an idea of their interpupillary distance. I know how well they're shaved. I know how wide their mouth is, what their ear placement is. And these are all things that my body grasps intuitively and immediately. So imagine a person in disbursements who needs to consider several hundred project proposals. And to do it, they just use facial representation. And more or less, the closer the face looks to a happy face or a sad face, the more likely they are to get to this disbursement. So there's the scene in the book where this vampire is looking over hundreds of potential options, and each of them is represented with this like somewhat monstrous or ghastly face. And that is what allows them to take in thousands of parameters at once by kind of co-opting the existing machinery of the fact that humans are very good, mostly, at parsing each other's faces.
Instinctive hardwiring.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So to me, I imagine that there's a bunch of cases in the Syndicate where people are taking advantage of those existing human tendencies in a way that is going to look utterly bizarre to anyone else. And suddenly the person talks about the face of the market. And it starts as a figure of speech referring to this data representation where maybe each face is an industry. But over time, it becomes a personality where two syndicate agents are talking and one does macroeconomic forecasts and one goes, what does the face of the world look like? And each country is a face and it shows various economic indicators or something like that. I think those quickly are going to turn into weird internal personifications. And it's not unreasonable to me that they start developing relationships with them in the same way that people develop a fondness for their Roomba or something like that.
That's how you get spirits, Terry.
Exactly. And I think that's how this weirdness comes in, because suddenly that agent is like, oh, I want to create an immersive realm for this. And oops, you just vulgated.
Wah, wah.
Yep. So dealing with the immaterial but documentary, things that can be numbered but are hard to assess, I think is another area where a lot of weird mystical stuff is going to start coming in.
I can accept that.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about the idea that also that people... So to me, the lead in for this is another thing about the Syndicate is people having too narrow a notion of capital.
Oh, don't they just? All right. So when you talk about my expertise in social science, heavy quotes. So I'm not an economist or anything. I haven't read Das Kapital, but I have thoroughly read some of the social theory stuff that stems from it, including the 600-page grimoire for primal utility that I am pulling out of my bag right now, which is Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction. I had to read this fucker twice for my PhD. It's 600 pages that basically state taste and class are determined and deterministic, is how I would sum it up.
Okay, can you give me a little bit more on what that is?
Well, so taken to its extreme, it's this idea that you can build almost a predictive model of someone's entire life course on the basis of their socioeconomic class. And what could be more syndicate than that?
Mm-hmm.
But like, I mean, you can define capital in a bunch of ways, but the way that when I've taught it, the way I've defined it is resources combined with the capability to leverage them. So a resource only has value when it's placed within a system that assigns value to it. So what Bourdieu does...
so you're not talking about labor as the actualization of capital.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So what Bourdieu does, and those who have drawn from his theories, is they break down those resources and their leverageability into three main branches. You have economic or material, social, and cultural, which you could probably shorthand into wealth, connections, and taste.
Okay.
Probably the three easiest ways to do it. And any of those can be transmuted into any of the others in different contexts. One could argue that social and cultural capital fundamentally do stem from the material, but since we're talking about mysticism, I think it's a little more interesting to kind of move away from the material. So the one I'm most into is linguistic capital. That's the privilege that's tied to certain languages or modes of speaking, communication as a symbol. When I teach sociolinguistics, I like to ask the students, I'm going to ask you, Terry, what is the most beautiful language? This is already more thought than any of my students put into it. So that's good.
So the natural bias I have is if we define beauty as the ability to interact with the ineffable and that which gives life value, I have to default to English because it is the maximal space. It is my blank canvas. There is no region that cannot be touched on it. If I wanted to go more abstract, I would have to go with something like mathematics because there is something profoundly beautiful to me about the ability to quantify a model. If an equation is a sentence, it is a sentence that can say infinite things. So it has a feature to it that would be known as compactness or high Kolmogorov complexity. The ability to embed a lot of information in a small thing. So like if I were to say like, what is the most beautiful sentence in that language, I would go with something like S equals K log W, which is the Boltzmann equation for entropy. But that is just kind of my biases flopping on the table.
I will tell you that neither of those answers is what I most commonly get in class because almost everybody says French or Italian. And
I think Spanish sounds nicer than French.
Well, see, here's
That's
the
just
thing,
me.
though. The point is that fundamentally, there's nothing about a language that necessarily makes it more or less beautiful. It is a matter of perspective. It is a matter of what you consider beauty to be. And
It sounds like they're answering the question of what language has the prosody you most enjoy.
I think the question they're answering is which language has been presented to you the most as being associated with beauty? Because in their cultural frame, French and Italian have this certain cachet, right? And that perspective, like it trickles into the language, but then it gets extended into making these value judgments like, oh, I think...
Cellar door.
Right. Or French accents are hot, or like all of these things. But it's all artificial. It doesn't mean it doesn't have some kind of power over our lives, but sometimes a lot of it, but it relies on that artificiality, that power. And its nature means it can and does change and evolve over time. From the syndicate point of view, I would say the idea that systems of social status exist at all, built around the use of symbols and symbolic practices, the fact that we have these constantly evolving ideas about aesthetics and fashion, the modern reality that even sleepers, if they're media savvy enough, can use those systems to accrue wealth or fame or success. Like, I would imagine the syndicate seeing that as evidence of some kind of organizing principle that's as sublime and difficult for the human mind to understand as a deity. And how deeply would they think about the techniques that they're using to manipulate these systems?
Yeah.
Like a chorister doesn't necessarily question the mechanics of the miracles they're doing, or of Ravenna, the sacrifices that they're doing. So they function the way they do because that's their nature. So if a syndicate operative puts some viral piece of media out into the world to achieve some end, the advantage over the sleepers is that they can precisely account for and adjust the unpredictability of its spread, which doesn't mean that they don't admire and respect the mystery of it.
And this helps answer the question to me of, I naturally go to the magic men when I think of the groups within, when I think of the methodologies. That's the group that brings the money in. Disbursement is the one that assesses what the rest of the technocracy wants, keeps track of what they have, and then determines who gets funding. You have the enforcers, who are kind of the muscle, but we get media control as a new one in Revise that tries to influence them. And to me, that feels like an interesting throwback to Victorian, where we had the Invisible Exchequer as well as the High Guild.
Yeah.
And one of them focused kind of on the numbers of the market, and the other one focused on the needs, wants, and desires, the art of desire aspect to it, which I think originally got introduced in Sorcerer's Crusade. So I like the fact that you are providing theoretical justification for, was it the High Guild or the Invisible Exchequers that were the art of desire folks?
High Guild. Okay. But they called it something else in Victorian. It's the Golden Guild. High Guild is Sorcerer's Crusade.
Yeah, okay.
And then,
okay.
Yeah.
So the Golden Guild were the ones that understood that art of desire. And I like the idea that after spending a century and a half being on the back foot and the numbers guys, as it were, kind of coming to the fore, they now have the theoretical backing. They now have the technocracy speak. They now know how to play the NWO HR game to justify coming back. And these are the kind of things that provide that framework. And suddenly we have syndicate members that aren't wealthy, but are certainly rich, in that they know how to play that influence game outside of using dollars and cents. And this is a way they have of being able to wrong foot other people. And this is the person who is able to infiltrate the Hermetic chantry and knows how those political games are being played. It's also interesting because that would be a group where jockeying for position would be proof that you know what's going on. Like, I feel like there would be these very well-established ideas of office etiquette, that it would be highly competitive and cutthroat, but you wouldn't be bringing other people down so much. Yeah. So, for instance, the example I use is, for the longest time, if you wanted to prove that you wanted to be in management, you would work longer hours, you would dress better, you would do all these symbolic acts that may not even generate more revenue for the company or may not indicate better returns, but that was your method of signaling. And that kind of competition, as opposed to competing for a grant or something like that, or sabotaging someone else's work, is not destructive towards someone else. So I like the idea that it kind of provides that framework. Do you think it makes more natural sense that this is the language in which they talk, or do you feel as if this is something they just happen to do within that group? Where I could see the NWO doing it very explicitly. Do you think the Syndicate, when they take advantage of these ideas of like social critique and role and other types of capital, would be as explicit, or was that kind of the question you were raising?
I think it's the question I was raising. But if I think about what I would answer, I think it would be less explicit. I think they would do it without even thinking. I was reading an article yesterday from The Cut, and it was about whatever slang term. And it was like all of 2024 slang. I was catching up at once. I was like, well, what does this mean? And like that deployment, knowing the right things to say, knowing the right ways to behave, knowing the right people, all of that is just as valuable as a big stack of cash, right? And they have come to understand that ahead of everybody else within the technocracy, is what I would say. And I don't think it's like, going back to what I was saying before about, I don't think they would want to fully control it. There is that little bit of animism in the idea of like the invisible hand of the market. Like, that's giving some kind of, not consciousness to the market, but, or like to say corporations are people too. I think they're primed to have this idea that the way they engage with this abstract collective force is the same way that they would engage with like a person. So their practices to charm and manipulate and whatever with people apply just as well to doing that to like the vast systems of exchange.
And I think that's one of those things where, as both their arete or quiet increases, that becomes more explicit. So now, like, to translate this to a mystic game, in the same way that one of the focuses that a goth character may use is 3 hours of putting on their vestments for the
Smoky
evening.
eye.
Is that the Syndicate is going to be, the people that practice this are going to do the same thing. Where it might not meet the court of Louis XVI, where people would spend hours watching a noble person get dressed, or people would consider the act of watching a dandy get dressed to be a kind of self-edification. But this kind of ritualistic thing where every morning I'm going to listen to the audio edition of the Wall Street Journal and the Economist while I very precisely do a set of stretches, then put on my suit, kind of get to the same place where they're trying to tap into this idea of almost this chaos magic like thing of I will imagine myself as what I want to be.
I will sell this house today.
What is that from?
American Beauty.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I anytime sales comes up, I'm always curious if it's going to be Glengarry Glen Ross or yes, sign on the line that is dotted.
See, I don't know the American Psycho getting ready montage well enough to reference that. So, but I know that's also a thing that is a thing.
Anyway, someone did a wonderful breakdown of the business card theme and scene and pointed out that it was idiotic because every one of them had misspelled the company name on their card compared to what was in the rest of the film, and all of them had different information in different location, and no corporate branding department worth its salt would allow that to happen. But do you think so? In Mage, the degree to which the mage realizes that they are doing magic can vary.
Oh, yeah.
I feel that this is a group that would be on the cusp of recognizing what that ritual is.
Yeah. I mean, I think they would go so far as to call it a ritual.
Okay.
But it just means something different. In the same way, corporate speak is great for this. Because, like, you could say, oh, I have my daily wellness ritual. And it's like they can mean that without any kind of reality deviance in the mix. So, yeah.
Because I want to make them the group that understands sociologically exactly what they're doing. But to me, within a game of Mage, that gets remarkably close to them realizing what magic is. And I feel like that's almost Mary suing the game, where like they're my perfect group that I love in every way. But that's a knob that has gone back and forth in Mage. Like the person who prays to God, do they recognize that they're doing a sphere effect? Sometimes in Mage they say that they are, and sometimes that they aren't. I think it's more interesting when you allow it to be anywhere in between the two.
Yeah.
Yes, the avatar is still involved, but does the mage always know metaphysically what is going on? I think it's okay for that answer to be much, much blurrier.
Oh, yeah. No, I like the blurry. Listen, I've worked with corporate ethnographers, and you want to talk about blurry lines.
Okay.
It's like where it gets really weird.
So what other rituals do you see that person going through? I see that morning wellness ritual. I see the mechanics of how a board meeting goes as being kind of the Syndicate version of a low-level mind and correspondence effect that lets everyone be on the same page.
That's a high-level effect to get everyone on the same page.
Yes. Again, that's why it's magic. That's why it's unrealistic. Yeah. The most vulgar thing a virtual adept can do is the USB drive always goes in correctly the first time. or something like that. But like, what other corporate rituals do you see that could have that slightly mystical bend to it? Like we could have the idea of a corporate retreat. One of the ones that came up to me is kind of like, you mentioned that sacrifice to get quintessence. I wonder if there's like a Shirley Jackson's Lottery version of this, and that is the form of stacked ranking. And you're like, the fact that we purge the worst 10% every quarter and the dread and anxiety that causes in the office is something we now harvest as a thing.
I'm trying to like think back to my array of experiences working in a bunch of different industries and companies and stuff. And I think about things like when there's like the open trading period, when you're allowed to trade stock, that feels like a primal utility free for all. Or when it's somebody's birthday, like, it's just kind of like it's weird. And this is why corporate ethnographers exist, because corporations or businesses in general are just as thoroughly culturally intricate as any remote village in the jungle or whatever. So each one is going to be different, but people are going to approach those practices with the same level of like, I'm entering ritual space that they would for something religious or whatever else.
But I do like the idea that now we have this Syndicate consultant that goes into a company and starts introducing these things. And that is how they are setting up their sympathetic connection. That is how they are bringing it down on that data chart where it's like, okay, we're going to go through this month-long process where we're going to convert you to Agile or something like that. Or we're going to do a Sendelani process. And by the end of it,
Kanban board wonder.
Exactly. And by the end of it, the fact that we have set up the perfect waterfall chart is the point where we now with just one success, we can see how your company is doing anywhere in the world. With two successes, we know where any employee that has a connected device is. And that is kind of the ritual there. But earlier you brought up the invisible hand. And there are a couple market abstractions that I know of, at least, that I think fit very naturally into a Mage game. And these were the ones that I was able to find. So one, we have the idea of the invisible hand. This is Adam Smith's idea that if you let a market run free, natural forces of supply and demand will adjust who receives capital, how labor is deployed, what materials will become available, and what the buying habits of the public are going to be. So I do like figuratively someone being like, invisible hand, and using that to justify a forces effect to just like slap someone. But some of the other ones was, one we get is Mammon, the embodiment or notion of greed and wealth that is frequently invoked in the Bible. And this is where we get the Mammonites as an Effendi group. And could this be the first thought form secular demon that we get? Sure. Another one was John Maynard Keyes, and then probably more popularized by Alan Greenspan, talked about animal spirits in the market. And one of the things to me I like about this is suddenly we have a middle umbra option for the market. And suddenly we could have this weird socio-emotional place in the middle umbra. Maybe it's not one of the near realms quite, but it's certainly something that was introduced in Dark Ages Fae, where we had, what was it, the Grand Bazaar or something?
Yeah.
And I think this is justified there. But the idea of animal spirits, that there are primal, unpredictable behaviors that humans exhibit that may be counter-cyclical. So I think we've all met the person who was surprisingly cheery when objectively things were going poorly, and vice versa. I think all of us have had a sense of dread or terror when things were completely going fine.
Oh, yeah. That sums up my life.
Yeah. So Alan Greenspan, former Fed chair, frequently spoke of the animal spirits of the market and their ability to act counter-cyclically. A market cycle is the idea that you have a deployment of capital. People are employed to take advantage of that capital, to use that money in the form of tools and production and education. They produce things, and that they are bought by other people. And sometimes the market can kind of spook itself that it thinks things will go bad. So people will start pulling capital back in. They will lay off workers and so on. And the thought that the market may go into a recession causes the market to go into a recession.
What about a black swan as a paradox spirit?
Yeah. So a black swan is a idea that was popularized by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in the book The Black Swan, which is the idea that there are large, unpredictable events that disproportionately influence the world around us. And the example he uses is over something like the last century. So basically post-World War II, this book was written in the early 2000s, so keep that in mind. Up until then, 50% of market gains over that period of time occurred through random positive general improvement. The idea that efficiency does increase, that increases the return on capital, and it allows employees to further access capital, and we make scientific and social advances that allow us to better apply and use capital that improves the quality and quantity of goods that we can get. LED light bulbs are just better than incandescent light bulbs in terms of generating light. Computers have gotten faster. Vehicles per ton have gotten more fuel efficient over time. But he points out that something like 10 days of market activity are responsible for the other 50% of the improvement. This is, in comparison, these are utterly remote events that should not happen, but turn out to be absolutely defining. And the most common question he has asked is, what is the next black swan? To which he said, if I could answer that question, it wouldn't be a black swan. But
that's syndicate logic right there.
Yeah. So I do like the idea that there are people that are out in the great ocean or are doing these time magic effects to try and find the black swan or black swan hunters.
Oh, I love that as an amalgam name.
The other thing about black swans is there are two sides of this, and people frequently forget the other one. A very rare event that does happen that is impactful, or what is believed to be a very common event that doesn't. And my best example of that is the fact that we have not had a nuclear war. If you asked any expert at any time if there would be another non-accidental exchange of nuclear weapons before the end of the 20th century, some non-trivial percentage of them said yes. And the fact that we didn't, any number of times where people think that a peaceful transfer of power will not occur, and it does. that would be considered another type of black swan. So yeah, you could have the black swan hunters, or it could be an idea that a syndicate member uses to justify an extraordinary intervention. We need to black swan this one.
See, we're developing the lingo even as we go through this.
And kind of the last two that I had was one, the Kraken of debt. This is an idea that as you go into debt, it just starts devouring resources and stability. So as student debt rises, people start entering a market where they're already 6 figures in the hole. There is already this downward pull on every dollar that you generate that is being sucked up by interest and principal that needs to be repaid. And to slay the Kraken would basically be to get the world to a point where so much debt had not been consumed. The other thing is that you could do something like you could beseech the Kraken. To me, the Kraken being an alternative to cockroach, being the tribal totem, as difficult as that word is to use appropriately, for the Glasswalkers, I think would be appropriate. And suddenly we have syndicate members that are in the Middle Umbra that are dealing with the Spirit Brood to try and get information to loosen the Kraken or to adjust where the Kraken of debt becomes applied. And in the same way that the worm has these other forms, why not the same as a Gaffling or Jagling for it? That you could spiritually use this Kraken mark on somebody's wallet and suddenly their transactions start getting turned down or overdue bills start to appear. The last one, which is a little bit different, is kind of the idea of market god. This is a term that kind of came out of criticism of the neoliberalist idea that the market was going to fix a lot of things, that if we just let prosperity spread, everything would be fine. And to some notion, I agree with that up until the point where the players in the game get to start being the referees. That's where things break down. When you get to start changing the rules of the game you're playing to disadvantage other players, we're no longer dealing in the same kind of fair market. And what was hopefully going to be an open market tends to start being oligopolistic, as only very large players that have the ability to counteract other people's political machinations are able to participate. And we talked about things like suddenly the Federal Reserve are the clergy. We have these investors and economists who have the vestments and raiments and positions and go through the rituals to indicate what interest rates are going to be to beseech that god. And again, as you went back to, is this jealous god where we need to do sacrifices or
your vestments better have shoulder pads?
Yeah, or is it something else? And I think this is going to be one of those things where syndicate members talk like this, but a few make the leap to go, no, I'm going to go talk to the Kraken. Or I'm literally going to pray to this god. And if no one knows that they're doing it and it seems to work, and systems-wise, there's no reason why you couldn't use a spirit roll or a time roll or whatever, or use these spirits as your agents of action. We have the idea of ensemble space. The Technocracy is fully comfortable with the idea of there being thought forms. They don't necessarily feel comfortable always using it. But I think this kind of syndicate chaos mage union is something that would be very potent. Yeah. So what do you think about this kind of spiritual angle?
Ooh, I've got a lot of thoughts. Well, okay, so I have a minor thought and a major thought. The minor thought is just like, when I think about thought forms and sigils and spirits, I think about branding and logos and mascots. And I would love the idea of brand loyalty as a form of chiminage to a spirit. Like just, you engage with the spirit of this brand by touting this brand, using this brand, whenever
or
possible.
A social media influencer who uses it as the cult background, where normally the cult background says, oh, you have 30 followers. Maybe I have 30,000, but it's all parasocial or something like that, and it gets us to the same place.
Yeah, and there's some kind of comment there about reality zones. I'm not sure what it is, but like if you truly believe that for whatever reason brand X is better than brand Y, does it actually become better in your little bubble of reality? And is part of the syndicate's way of shaping consensus by doing that on a large extended scale, like virally through their cult, essentially. There's, I'm going to drop another theorist in here. Roland Barthes wrote the book Mythologies back in the late 50s or whatever. It's this collection of essays, among other things, about pop culture expressions of meaning making. So one of the landmark passages is about the kind of incipient, at the time, mythology of laundry detergent commercials. And he talks about, I think it was the brand Omo, which is a French detergent brand. They were one of the first to really highlight foaming and bubbles as like a quality of their laundry soap. And it created this idea that a deeper clean is like bubbles and foam create a deeper clean, which is not scientifically, it is not undergirded by science. It is just good marketing. But it like took hold and caught on in the public consciousness. And now it's like, you have to make your product foam if you want people to buy it and keep buying it. So like when I think about what the Syndicate would do with those kinds of connections, I think that they would be much more than like a dream speaker who's just kind of engaging with the spirit out of respect and because it's the right thing to do to bring them towards ascension. The Syndicate is 100% doing this for their own ends.
I feel that that's also an interesting avenue that a Syndicate member could use for the weirdest counter magic we have ever seen. That effect in those shoes or something like that.
Yeah,
or,
perfect.
Or like, oh, you call that an offering?
Yeah.
Just the 10,000 ways in which they could nag and review to that. Or maybe it is one of those things where part of their counter magic is they start streaming to their media followers and they're like, look at this schlub. Look at this cuck for the high umbral court. and look at him totally try and simp to get the attention of Gaia. This is lamentable.
I love it.
Yeah. And suddenly that is the mode through which you do it. And you mentioned what I will call Roland Barthes.
Wow.
In my ignorant Western tongue. And like Umberto Eco did the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was just more formal about it.
Was he?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they are both characters in The Seventh Function of Language by Laurent Barthes.
Oh, interesting. Because to me, the thing about Umberto Eco's stuff was it always felt friendly. I never felt like I was being drowned in things.
No, when I say, I mean, about like these were the collection in mythologies, it's largely like magazine columns. So they're each like 2 pages.
Okay, got it.
So it's just very surface level in a sense, but incisive. So another French theorist who I had to read in my PhD program was Pierre Lévy. He wrote the book Collective Intelligence. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he writes about the evolution of 4 anthropological spaces, which I'm going to make very rough connections here. Those are the social and cultural framings built from these processes of meaning making, where the systems of value around immaterial capital operate. So first is the geographic or earth space, which is associated with like prehistoric and hunter-gatherer communities, whose object is humanity. Everything is related back to the immediate human experience, the immediate world that you live in, your family relationships, the narratives you share. After that comes territorial space, where you start to create abstractions and divisions. You develop social stratification and the idea of our territory versus their territory. You rely on things like writing and religion to define boundaries larger than yourselves. Third is commodity space, whose object is change itself. And so it's really just capitalism. It grows from that artificiality of value and the creations of meanings. It centers on your career as an identity and your engagement with stuff. The fourth and last is knowledge space, which is the purpose of his book. It's very much like 90s cyber utopianism. Eventually we'll all realize that we're singularities and just trade knowledge, whatever. But the point of the book is that that space is so difficult to achieve because capitalism has gotten so good at capturing any attempt to break out of it. So like in the class where we had to read this, we talked about how when the World Wide Web first debuted, the techno-utopianism was strong and everyone was like, this is going to liberate us into a new era of mutual understanding. And then after 6 months, it was all porn and shopping because capitalism saw the opportunity and seized it. So, you know, I think the Syndicate would recognize that power of commodification and be inspired by it. I don't think their god is money. I think it's commodity. So when they work the art of desire, like as a practice, that's an offering to commodity. When they choose that Armani suit and the expensive shoes and everything, rather than, I don't know, pajamas or whatever the verbena wear, they're putting on those vestments to show their devotion. And they know how much they're in tune with that force by doing it, as much as any priest would. And commodity may be a vengeful deity, but they would have no need. They wouldn't be the ones in the line of fire. If something goes wrong for them, they roll with the punches, is how I would see it.
This makes me feel as if this is a really good avenue for Syndicate mind effects against another character, to just kind of do this mimetic reduction of them, where they just kind of glance at them and are like, this is everything you're wearing. This is what I see in you. You are no different. You are just railing ineffectively against the cage that I have put you in, and be like, oh yeah, sure, you wove your own clothing. That's so cute. I see tradcore moms on Instagram doing the same thing, and somehow you think you are better. And slowly this is how they start bleeding off the willpower, or slowly this is how we start accruing the negative modifiers to the mind effect.
I just want to real quick say, in my notes I have bring up scene from Devil Wears Prada, which you have just perfectly encapsulated. So yes.
I also like the idea that this is either, in one way, how they do entropy effects, where it's like, no, of course, this is a Bentley. I don't care that you shot at my tire. It's not breaking down. Entropy 3, suddenly those effects are there. And this kind of creates a weird second character sheet that a Syndicate mage doing this needs to have, where they're like, these are my possessions. These are the associations I have with them. And now, instead of having this relationship web, we have this cognition web of what each of your things do. And suddenly, like, your character's loadout are the collection of things that they would want to possess and show for whatever event that they're going to. I also like this as the idea of a way to justify Syndicate arcane, where it's like, no, I am the perfectly average person here. Or I'm going to be slightly worse than that. People are going to turn their noses up at me. And this is how I navigate the space unseen. That is one of my character superpowers, where I just always know how to dress in such a way that people can't see it. And it makes me wonder how many people in the Syndicate have access to spirit. There's a scene in the game Control where you pick up a phone and you basically call the astral. And the board, the group that is kind of guiding you through this, is always kind of on the other line. So I wonder, a thing I would need to think about more is, if we have a character, even if they're not using spirit, but are still using spirit chiminage methods to interact back and forth, how we decide to make them look. This kind of reminds me of the problem in the Technocracy of, so what does the seeking look like? Or how do you interpret your avatar? And I feel like that's going to be a really good in for this, to figure out kind of where that goes. What do you think the Syndicate makes of the digital web?
Ooh. I think that they would see the digital web as being potential in the same way that the virtual adepts see it as potential, but for totally different purposes. I mean, going back to what I was saying about the liberation of knowledge and consciousness versus the, wow, we can sell anything to anybody, anywhere, anytime. Like that, I think they would have a much more craven use for it, in a sense.
Yeah, to me, I think they would view it as this weird backwater.
I also think, though, they would very unlike the virtual adepts, see it as being almost lawless, or rather they would probably, they might do a lot of damage, in the sense that virality, in terms of like media and success, does not proceed along predictable lines more often than not. So whereas the adepts might go in and say, this is how you build the web, this is how you influence the web, the Syndicate comes in and just like, we're gonna sell what we want and send it through the web. And
because the last thing I want to kind of discuss for this conversation about the Syndicate is, what are the otherworldly places that a Syndicate member may or may not have access to? And I had a few ideas on what this was. Established within the game, we have the Bazaar from Dark Ages Fae. I think that is something perfectly reasonable to bring back in. We don't get a lot of named places that I know of in the High Umbra or the Middle Umbra that would have these places. But to me, one of the natural cases would be the Spire. There are so many cultures that have a god of wealth, and frequently it is a god of wealth and fertility, or luck and wealth, or wealth and fortune. And we have like Fortuna, Lakshmi, Mercury, Hermes, Tyche, Kubera, Kaishen, Bigan, Freyr, Hathor, Isis, Ea. Anansi is even listed as providing wealth to those who are able to see through the cleverness. And I feel as if there's going to be this weird spiritual pollution that the Syndicate is responsible for in forcing every culture to have a god of wealth. I feel like it's one of those things that like was retroactively put on it, like in the same way that like Catholicism may have like a god of computer programmers, which by definition couldn't have come about when St. Christopher or whatever was first canonized, but to be like, oh, these jobs kind of fit together in this way. So I feel as if they are going to have a natural presence in at least some of the spires. I feel like there should be a grand marketplace in the Vulgate, in the same way that we have the Library of Alexandria, in the same way that we have the Fortress of Government. I feel like commerce has to be one of those things that would get some sort of embodiment there.
And it's interesting. I'm going to paint with a broad brush here when I say this, but of all of the convention, again, maybe with the exception of New World Order, when you look at like the progenitors and iteration X and stuff, I think that with a lot of the larger faiths in the world, you might have to do more work to kind of justify, like, what does a progenitor of faith look like? What does an iterator of faith look like? That to me is more difficult to answer than what does a syndicate person of faith look like? Because really, I feel like there's a disconnection between those two sides of them. I feel like a syndicate person could absolutely, because I've known people like this, go to work Monday through Friday being an absolute corporate asshole and then go to church on Sunday and feel totally fine about it and probably think that they're divinely inspired for what they're doing. So like from the technocracy perspective, I don't know how much they would care with that as long as that belief system is not intruding on the practices that they're doing in the service of the organization. But I think that the crossover between those opens up some interesting possibilities. I think it's Kubra who has the little marmot who vomits jewels, which I think would be a great familiar for a syndicate person.
Do you feel that there is a area of the dreaming or the low umbra that you think the syndicate would be interested in? I feel like they would, depending on how you interpret it, I feel like there would be a graveyard of ideas. These are all the things that have failed.
Which you can pillage for retro purposes.
Exactly.
So.
For retro purposes, or to say, hey, this idea hadn't come yet. Almost like an inverse inventium. And again, however you want to take the low umbra in Mage, that's fine. That's really up to you. But I also think that there is this weird gospel of wealth afterworld that just kind of makes everyone uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that keeps some syndicate members up at night, being like, really? Is that gold-plated heaven? Is that where we wind? And I like that as an idea of how seriously are we going to take this? What kind of existential dread do we want to have come in on the game? But what was your most Mystic Syndicate moment?
I thought of it because it would be, in my mind, a good space to kind of conceptualize for an other world. So at the Tate Modern in London, which is converted from a power plant, there's a space called the Tanks, which was the oil storage tanks, and they do installation art in there. So I went and saw this piece called The Way Earthly Things Are Going, which was by Emeka Ogbo from Nigeria. And so it was, and this was like New Year's Eve, so it was dark and it was cold and it was late at night. It was just this big, empty, circular metal room along the, probably about 15 feet high. And along sort of the top of the wall, running around the entire room, was a stock ticker. And the numbers were red if the stock was going down, green if it was going up, yellow if it was flat, but like real-time stock prices. Nothing else in the room except like a bench or two where you could sit. And then coming in through speakers was this song, Alismo no Hecheromai, which is a Greek traditional lament whose title translates to When I Forget, I Rejoice. And it's a very minor key, melancholy, as Greek laments tend to be, to echo around the hills. So like, but the volume was up and it just reverberated the whole room with this like wailing, beautiful music as you like watched the numbers march by. It was profoundly moving. But there's also like a sensory deprivation quality because that was like the only sensory stimuli. So I don't know what kind of effect you'd get out of that, or maybe that would be like a paradox realm they go to or something, but that space is like something I visualize when I think of like what would profoundly move a syndicate person in a mystical way. And it's that kind of moment of, you know, because like seeing the numbers on the page or even seeing how you're wearing the right clothes, acting the right way, you can see how that manifests in your interactions in the world. But what gives them that deep feeling of the sublime when they interact with those things? So that's what it makes me think of.
There is room in this because the syndicate talks about value, and as trite as it may sound, like love and beauty are of value.
Yeah.
So is that what retirement is for a syndicate mage? Do they finally get to do that? Like there's this kind of crass interpretation of wealth that we can go for, but I feel as if Mage is at its best when we remind that even our antagonists have some uncomfortable truth that they can bring to bear on things. I remember one of the most affecting lines in my early Mage reading, so literally when I was in middle school, and I think it was Book of Mirrors, and it was talking about how to humanize antagonists, and it is, what do you do when you find out the black suit who's been pursuing you has a rescue dog?
Aww.
Yeah. And I imagine syndicate members do have those weird pet projects. And to me, to go to a mystical thing, like I feel as if a syndicate member's true name is the set of all positions that they hold in the market. And maybe even part of that is that secret hidden thing that allows them to stay human. Like a lot of games have sanity anchors or stability anchors, that thing you interact with after you've seen the monstrous to return to where you are. So I have this fiction piece I've worked on where most syndicate members have a hobby that uses their hands. Just kind of as a stabilizing thing to connect to. Yeah, their invisible hands. Yes. Phantom limb from the Venture Brothers. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are these weird things globally that these nonprofits that have exceptionally good funding due to this mysterious benefactor.
And they don't all have to be altruistic at heart. I mean, you certainly have complete asshole ones. I mean, looking at the inspirational media, that like obviously Wall Street, Wolf of Wall Street, all of that. But then it's nice to think about the counterpoints that might exist. So I feel like this is a good place to wrap up. It feels as if kind of our key points are, like, my key things that I wanted to bring across are that syndicate members are going to be influenced by their culture. So you spend a large time embedded in an area, you're going to start picking up things. You start working in an animist area of the world, you're probably going to start thinking in animistic terms. So to me, a lot of this fun stuff then comes from character background, what their investments are, and where they are taking place. And that gives us an easy in. The other aspect of it is syndicate members can kind of get away with whatever they want as long as they're not too loud about it. Mm-hmm. To me, most syndicate members, their investments are kind of a closely guarded secret, and that gives them some obscurity from that in a way that maybe isn't the case with some other technomantic group. And the final thing is just, what does it look like when a syndicate member interfaces with spirits or decides to use spirits as part of their practice? I think it's certainly there. It may be through a level of obfuscation. They may be emailing an umbrood or something like that, or they may only do it when they go into their weekly sensory deprivation dip or something like that. And Pooka, I feel like kind of your key thing was these are masters of the symbol, the sigil, and the hyper-sigil. Among the masters.
Yes. Any other key takeaways that you have?
I guess I would just add that I don't think they are nearly as siloed as they think they are, and certainly not as much as the technocracy would like them to be.
Okay.
When I think about the academic angle and the ivory tower metaphor, so to me, NWO, that's the ivory tower. The syndicate are the applied academics who are going out and doing the field work and whatever else. And by virtue of putting these ideas into the field so often, either through direct engagement with sleepers or through, the products and whatever they're putting out there, there's going to be some backwash, like filthy backwash. And it's just going to, like you say, if they go into a market where they're dealing with 100,000 sleepers who all believe in this deity, there's no way that they can fully cut themselves off from the possibility that deity might be out there if they're going to maximize their profits to the best of their ability. They have to let that in a little bit to do their best work. And they're comfortable with that, I think. And
I feel that also gives us an idea of what syndicate quiet looks like.
Yeah. Especially if you get moved from job to job. Yes. And suddenly you've got all these.
Yes. One of the key things that they have to be able to do is open themselves to the movement of the market, what the Vox Populi is wanting, what the market signals are telling them. And when you stare into the void stares back. When you stare into the market comes to possess you a little bit. But I think this is a good stopping point for now. We had a bunch of listener questions, which hopefully we'll get to talk about next time we talk. And I came up with 12 additional methodologies that I thought that the syndicate could have.
You did.
So maybe we can go through those.
I still have a whole page on hyper-narratives to talk about too.
Nice. Yeah. Pook, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where money makes the world go round, but magic makes the whole Tellurian go pear-shaped. We'd like to take the time to thank our executive producers, whose esteemed ranks you can join at www.patreon.com/magethepodcast, and to include the following oracles of various shreddable cheeses. Bad Company, Oracle of Aged Parmesan. Ben Bandelow, Oracle of Sharp Cheddar. Buck Gregory, Oracle of Fresh Mozzarella. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Provolone. Derek Semsick, Oracle of Colby Jack. John Cap, Oracle of Grana Padano. Guy Stewart, Oracle of Red Leicester. Joshua Hilderup, Oracle of Emmental. Sean Gallagher, Oracle of Pecorino Romano. Spartacus, Oracle of 18-month Comté. And the crew of Erebus, Oracle of Feta, which, despite being crumbled rather than shredded, deserves inclusion here. We'd also like to thank Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Berto, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Jeff Bryn, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aron, Archmaster Simon Strand, Archmaster Wolf Larison, Alex, Alexander, Alexia, Amberversion, Andrews S., Blaise Hibbert, Bryce Perry, Bill, Chartan, Sig, Cromwell the Archaeologist, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dorcadus, Drunk Des, Ian Robertson, EBG, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fozzie Barra, Fuse82, George Lara, Gray Trillig H, Henry Kraft, Ia Bull, Jade Barath, James B., Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jenna F., Jeremy Z., Jervis Johnson, Joshua Rotella, Kathleen Halprin, Kelrick, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Lawson Stuff, Makeshift, Manel Canos, Matthew Proyle, Maurice Hopkins, Melissa Krause, Michael Parker, Nibero, Nikita Klemanoff, Otter Wraith, Patrick McNamara, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Ryan Stray, Samuel Tobin, Seven S's, Starfish, Stephen Carton, That's Real Nito, Tyler Bryan, and Will Vincent. Our EP shoutout this week is to Drunk Des, the second syllable of whose name also happens to be the ISO standard 3-letter code for the Dengese language. Spoken by only a few thousand people in the vicinity of Mbuji-Mayi, a principal city of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Dengese is a member of the Bantu family that extends across sub-Saharan Africa. A notable feature of the Bantu languages and of the broader Atlantic Congo family of which they are a part is the use of prefixes to signify a large number of noun classes. This is analogous to classifications in Indo-European languages that use suffixes but without the heavy-handed gendering. For example, the prefix ki in Swahili indicates things in the abstract, whence the name Kiswahili for the language in the language itself. There are many little variations in this system among the hundreds of Bantu languages, which makes me curious how one would sort out the various elements of sorcery and ritual. I can't find ready data for the set of classificatory prefixes in Dengese, but as I search for them in my quest to translate the M20 core book into every language on Earth, Drunk Des, I'll think of you. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or talk to us at magethepodcast.bisky.social on Blue Sky. We have a Hopin Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. For the road is long and ascension awaits.